Dig those crazy tunes. Hey, everybody, JK here from Animator Island. How's it going? Welcome to today's live stream. I'm still getting some things set up since I'm a little new to this, and we're going to figure things out as we go. So let me open the chat window and get all the other fun stuff ready to go, and we'll start to talk about what we're here to talk about today. So today we're talking about character proportion, and it's going to be quite in depth, so it's going to be exciting. But what I wanted to talk about is a kind of general setup for probably most of the live streams that I do going forward. Ferdinand has his method, and I'm going to try and make my own too. What we're going to do is we're going to start out with a lecture, and we're really going to go in depth on character proportion. And then from there, we will branch off into application, which is taking everything that we just talked about in some form or another, and we're going to apply it, fire up the iPad and sit there and do some drawing and some analyzing and continue that process. And then at the end, we'll do a Q&A if anybody's interested, wants to ask any questions, whether it's related to character proportions or whether you want to talk about something like animation or art in general. As long as it's mostly on topic, we can go ahead and get those questions in too. So that'll be at the end. I did want to say, if you have a question, feel free to type it in chat as you're going. If I miss it though, because I'm going to try and jump back and forth between things, if I miss it, copy and paste it. When we get to the Q&A section, make sure you ask that question, because I would rather you ask and then me hopefully answer than me miss the question, because chat kind of just goes by sometimes and we're trying to talk about multiple things at the same time. Hey, Idolon Endimion. I hope I pronounced that right. How's it going? Welcome to the live stream. Okay, so with that out of the way, I think we're in pretty good shape to get started. And I have a nice little tag thing to show. Oh, look at that, pops up on the screen. So we're now going to be in the lecture section, and we're going to talk about character proportion. So let's get right into it. I'm going to share the iPad, and I will go down in the little corner, and I'll jump back and forth, and we'll talk about some things. So here we go. Character proportions. All right, you see here we have got the Vitruvian Man by Leonardo da Vinci, based on the work of an architect named Vitruvius, but you don't really need to know that. And today we're going to talk about character proportions, and we're specifically going to talk about human character proportions. Now, the good news is that all of this stuff can be applied to all sorts of different characters. You can do animal characters, you can do human characters, you can do creature characters. You can even apply a lot of these principles to things like backgrounds or objects. But today we're really going to focus on the human form. That's what we're going to study today, and we're going to talk a little bit about. So before we dive in entirely, let's take a look at some definitions of proportion, because it's good to get everybody on the same page. And right now we're going to look at the last one on the list here specifically. Hey, Vivek. All right, so the last one here says, and then we'll talk about it, the correct, attractive, or ideal relationship in size or shape between one thing and another, or between the parts of a whole. And then it goes on to say, as an example, perceptions of color, form, harmony, and proportion. Although we're not going to get to those other three things today, but we're going to talk about proportion. So to begin, we need to look at the beginning, that first part, before I jump into that. Jallowidian says, is today gonna be feedback? We are probably not going to get to feedback today. Maybe a little bit in the Q&A section, we'll see. But today's going to start out with a lecture, and then we're going to move on to some application, and then we'll do a Q&A. So I hope that is informative for the rest of your day, so you can decide. So let's take a look at this definition real quick. The beginning of this definition for proportion uses the words correct, attractive, or ideal relationship. Okay, so what we need to do to start out, so that nobody is confused and we don't get upset about anything, we need to talk about the difference between something objective and something subjective, right? There may be objective beauty. It may exist. I'm not convinced it doesn't. But what that would essentially be beauty that exists with or without us, right? If tomorrow every human being on the planet died off, would beauty still exist? Or is it strictly, as the old saying goes, in the eye of the observer or beholder? I think that something called objective beauty could exist. It very likely does, in my opinion. But that's neither here nor there, because that's not what we're talking about today. When we're talking about correct, attractive, or ideal, we're going to take a very subjective approach. That means that my opinions may differ than your opinions, and that's totally okay, because we're not diving into objectivity at the moment. We're diving into strictly subjective opinion on character proportions. Now, some things are going to be just simply honestly true, right? So if you have a certain distance between your torso and your pelvis, that is an objective measurement. But our opinion of if it's ideal or not may be directly related to how we feel about it. So that's the sort of thing I wanted to get out of the way first. When we say things like the correct, attractive, or ideal relationship today, we are talking about our opinions of it and what we think. So, okay, let's dive in. So, first up, you may have seen, get rid of that. You may have seen some of these images before. Specifically, right now we're going to talk about the one on the left here. When it comes to character proportion, we in the art world very often talk in terms of heads. Heads high, heads long, because the human head is something that we can use to measure the rest of the figure. So if you look at this example, this particular artist says that a normal, realistic human proportion would be about 7.5 heads tall. And then the idealistic proportion, according to them, would be 8 heads tall. If you're drawing for fashion, we would be looking at something along the lines of 8.5 heads tall. And then their category of heroic is 9 heads tall. All right. So the first thing that we need to understand is that this is a sort of starting point, right? It is not the be-all, end-all of every character that you will ever do. And one of the things that can sometimes get in our way is becoming such a slave to these ideas of, I got to measure how many heads something is, that we lose some of the life, right? Ito says, 8 heads looks pretty tall. Yep, I agree. 8 heads does look pretty tall. But here's an interesting bit of trivia. I am a bit of a freak. So my head, if you'll note, is actually very small. And my arms and my legs are ridiculously lanky. And I have a very slender build, which we'll get into in a minute. But just for kicks, I went and took a photo of myself and measured my head's tall height. And I would fit in the heroic category, according to this chart, which is utter nonsense, because you'll see this heroic figure over here is super buff and he's got lovely proportions in that regard. But that's exactly why we can't simply talk about heads tall all the time, because if someone has a very small head, they're going to be a very different head height than everybody else. But it is a useful measurement if you're just talking about a measurement within the character and their individual proportions. So given that I just mentioned I am a lanky monster and this heroic character is not, let's talk a little bit about the difference between proportion and body type, because it's really important that we understand the difference there. I found this image online, and what you'll see here is that the woman on the left, let me clear our, sorry, I'm not used to clearing with not just gestures, which I guess I could use. Anyway, the woman on the left here, according to this image, has a longer torso, and the woman on the right has a shorter torso. Okay, so this is just referring to the distance between, well, they're probably using top of the head to the iliac crest, which is the hip bones. And even then, their lines are a little bit wonky, but that's okay. For an example, it works. So The woman on the left has what we would say is a longer torso. The woman on the right has a shorter torso. That would be their proportions, okay? But that is not their body type. They have a very different body type, which is a different thing than proportion. It has relational aspects to proportion, but it's not the same. So the woman on the left is extremely thin, like me level thin. Probably she's underweight. She needs to eat some more. But I don't know that. I couldn't say for sure. But she is very thin. The woman on the right is more like a normal human being, right? She has more actual flesh, muscle, and fat on her, which means that her body type is dramatically different than the first person's body type. And when it comes to body type and proportion, one thing that I think is useful, or at least has been for me, to think about it, is that proportion has a lot more to do with the skeletal structure. Okay. So, for example, if you took two people who had almost identical skeletal structures and you put them next to each other, and one of them nearly starved themselves to death and was just skin and bones, and the other one ate ravenously and never exercised and became very overweight, they would have dramatically different body types, but their proportions, which is down to the skeletal level, is going to be very similar. And so that's, I think, an easy way to tell the difference between proportions and body type. And we'll talk a little bit more about body type and proportions, or we'll continue to talk about proportions. We'll talk more about body type as we go along. All right, so continuing along, let's go to our next slide. I think that this one is very useful to understand the idea of proportion. So if we take a look at this first character over here, well, first of all, you can see that this is still measuring things in head height, which is not necessary. Oh, it looks like we've got, oh, no, sorry. I was distracted by something on the corner of the screen I thought popped up, but it didn't. We have something in the chat. Roger says, interesting, heads tall height, but these were drawn just as 2D dimensions for entertainment, which is why these wonky proportions is why they drew them that way, is my guess. Yes, so the image that we just saw regarding heads tall is a very artistic and stylized version of things. It's not full realism because we're talking about things that are pushed because we're talking about art. All right, so in terms of these images that you see today right in front of you, we're still talking about heads tall, but we're kind of going to ignore that for a second. Instead, we're just going to look at proportion. So if you look at the character all the way to the left, you will see that their head is about that tall and their body is about there and their legs are about there. And if we go all the way to the character on the right, you will see that their head is about here and their body is about here and their legs are about here. Now, if I take what we just drew here and we shrink it down in size but keep the proportion, you will see that the character all the way on the right's proportions are very different than the character all the way on the left, right? Because the head on this one is probably in the neighborhood of a third, and the body is in the neighborhood of a third, and the legs are in the neighborhood of a third. The head's a little smaller, but it's essentially that's what we've got. And then on this character, the head is all the way to like a half, which is ridiculous. And then of the remaining half, which is still less than a half, this is broken up into about a half. So that would be the difference between these character proportions. And I think that this gives you an example of exactly the nature of proportion. The ratios of things to other things within the character. So here we have a few drawings that I did that showcase some vastly different character proportions. As you can see, the first character has a decently large head and then a very small torso and a ridiculously small pelvis and then monstrously long legs. This sort of proportion to a degree appeals to me because it reminds me, actually I have a picture here. It reminds me of the proportions of some characters from Headless Animation Studios. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them, but there was a trailer or something called I'm a Monster. And I don't know if you've ever seen it, but if you've never seen it, you should totally look it up. I will do my best to remember to put it in the description below the video after everything is said and done. But that reminds me of those character proportions. I just like how weird and interesting they are, and it's really fun to animate that sort of thing. So that's the first character that we've got here. So then if we move on to this middle character has pretty basic proportions. I mean, it's nothing extreme like the first one, but they're still slightly different than a regular character's proportions. The second one might do well to be like a dwarf character, to be honest, because the head is a certain height. Then you've got the torso and pelvis, which kind of in the last example, we combined into one. And then you've got the legs. And so we've kind of broken things up into thirds a little bit here. Whereas in terms of realistic proportion, especially for men, the pelvis usually is about the halfway point, or actually it's a little lower than the halfway point. So this may be a little closer to a more realistic human male. And the female line would probably be drawn somewhere around the halfway point. But again, those are just generals because humans are all different. And then if we took a look at this last character, you can see they have pretty much normal size head, slightly smaller, but normal size torso. And then the pelvis is ginormous, right? And the legs are slightly shorter. So it's important to understand that this character's proportions does not necessarily make them what you would call fat, right? Because large hips doesn't necessarily mean you're fat, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. It just means that you happen to have a very large pelvis. I mean, that's just, some people are born with smaller rib cage, larger pelvis. It's just the uniqueness of human beings, and that's totally okay. So continuing along, we can look at some of these images from Disney characters. We have Nani from Lilo and Stitch, and we have Jasmine from Aladdin. What I'd like you to notice here is, firstly, that they do use the heads tall measurement. This is a very useful thing in model sheets for animation, because then you know exactly where things fall. That's why usually there's lines across from the heads to see where the landmarks are compared to head size. But Jasmine here is a little more than 5 heads tall, and Nani is 7 heads tall. However, if you look closely, what you will note is that the characters actually have pretty similar proportions in a lot of ways. You can't measure them by their head height, but if you measure it based on the totality of the characters, hey, Tangible, what you'll find is that the characters have very similar proportions, which is to say they have their heads here, their, well, let me do an egg shape. Their torsos are here, their pelvis is here, and then they have typically pretty long legs. And we're going to see the same thing here in terms of proportions. Their proportions are actually very similar, but you can see these characters are very different. And part of that is body type, and part of that is just style choices. But you can see that proportionally, they have pretty similar skeletal structures and that sort of thing. So I thought that was rather interesting. Continuing along, let's discuss for a minute one more category. Okay, so we have proportion and we have body type. And then there's this third thing, which we can call shape. Okay, shape can be in reference to proportion, and it can also be in reference to body type. And that's why we have to be very careful that we don't confuse all these things and try and make them one thing, because they're very different things. So if you look at the characters at the top of the screen here, this set, and even the bottom ones, but we'll get to them in a second, this set of characters at the top have a variety of different proportions. But the thing that the artist was trying to convey here is shape design, shape appeal. And that's very different than proportion, because you could take similar shapes and put them in all sorts of different proportion. You can also, to a degree, take similar shapes and make them different body types. So shape design is something kind of unique to itself, and it can be related to proportion, and it can be related to body type. but it's almost its own thing, and we need to kind of treat it as such. If you look down at the Aladdin images at the bottom here, what you'll see is that the shape, that it's really talking about shape here and how there's a variety of shapes. And that's a really good principle in general. If you're going to have characters, it's nice to vary the shapes. And there's all sorts of things on shape design, and we could talk about that another time. But if you do look here, one thing that they noted, the actual artist noted on this sheet, is that they said the Sultan has a low waist and Jafar has a high waist. And so you can see that Jafar has these really long legs after the high-waisted of his pelvis. And then the Sultan, whose pelvis is enormous, has almost no legs at all. But it's interesting because when you watch Aladdin, you don't feel like the Sultan is a freak or a monster, right? He's just, that's his character design. And that's the beautiful thing about art and animation. We can push things to ridiculous places and it still seems relatively normal because we intended it to be that way. And so it's very different in that regard. Sorry, reading the chat real quick. All right. So then we can run and talk one more thing about proportion and body type and shape. Okay. You may be familiar with the animated short Inner Workings. It's from Disney. And in Inner Workings, well, first of all, everything in Inner Workings was ridiculously stylized. But in Inner Workings specifically, there is a character who we see at the top here, this girl at the beach with the puffy red hair. And Disney got a lot of blowback. They got a lot of hate mail regarding this character. It wasn't necessarily even a ton of people. They were just very loud people when it came to this character. Long story short, the people were unhappy with the body type of this character and said, Disney should be ashamed for ever even making this character. It shouldn't exist. How dare you? All these things. People get offended very easily sometimes. So let's talk about this character for a second, related to art and then related to proportion. First, let's go with proportion because that's a little less philosophical. This character's proportion in here is her rib cage. Obviously, her head's up here, and it's got a very interesting shape. But in here is her rib cage, and then here is her pelvis, which is rather enormous. But what I want you to note, if we scoot this over, is the space in between the rib cage and the pelvis. This space specifically. This is absurd, okay? And I mean that from a realistic perspective. I don't mean that from an artistic perspective. Human beings, if they had that amount of space between their tiny rib cage and their enormous pelvis, would die. They could not survive. The spine cannot support that much. That person would not be able to live in the real world. So I think that it's important to note that. And one of the really cool things that I once had taught to me by Samantha Youssef, who you may recognize the name from our video on Animator Island, Good Teachers and Good Artists. She taught taught about this aspect between the proportion of the torso or rib cage and the pelvis. So what you can do if you want to, I'm still a little weirded out by doing it, but I do it anyway. If you reach down and feel where your ninth rib is, okay? The ninth rib, which is kind of attached to the 10th rib, is the protruding bone right under your torso that kind of sticks out. And so if you feel where that is, and then you go down just a little bit and you feel where the iliac crest is. Here, let me draw it so that you can get an idea of what I'm talking about. So you have your rib cage here, your sternum, and then it kind of comes out like this. And this is the back of where the false ribs are. This point right here, you can feel on yourself. And often, depending on your body type, you can see that point because that's a protruding bone. And then on your pelvis, you have what is called the ilium, which is this back area, and then you have the iliac crest, which is this, which sometimes we call a hip bone. So if you reach on yourself, don't do this to other people, but do it on yourself. You can feel the ninth rib, that spot where the end of the rib cage is, and then you could feel down to your hip bone, which is usually protruding as well. Not a lot of muscle or fat grows on the hip bone, so you can usually find that regardless of your body type. But you can get an idea of how far that is in terms of distance. And what you'll find is that it's actually much shorter than most people realize. So if you're going to typically draw a character, especially if you're shooting for more realism, you're going to have the rib cage here, and you're going to have the pelvis very close below it. So there's not going to be a ton of room in between those two things. In this character, as we saw, we've got the rib cage, and then we've got this pelvis down here, and there's this ridiculous amount of space between the two. And this continues throughout the film, the short, because if you look down here, we have a similar thing. You have this person who has a rib cage here, and their pelvis is down here, and look at all the space between the two. It's crazy pants. I mean, it's fascinating that they pushed it that far and still managed to have the characters be human beings. Another interesting thing, I think, is if we look at the main character, who has a very square head, you'll find that this character's torso and pelvis is still, in spite of being not quite as extreme as that character, it's still a pretty substantial difference between those two shapes. He's very long, and everything is very elongated in this short, which is really interesting, I think, anyway. So that's just what I wanted to talk about in regards to the characters and proportion. Let's talk for a second about this whole outrage with Disney and the body type of this particular character. Okay, so it is unlikely that any animator or character designer who worked on inner workings sat down and thought, you know what I want to do? I want to convince people that they should have basically hips like a whale and no waist whatsoever. I want to convince human beings that that should be the ideal. And then they designed a character around that. Like, that is pretty much abject nonsense. Nobody sat down and tried to do that to try and say that's how reality should be. They weren't talking about reality in the short in that regard. You don't create a character like that and say that would be my realistic ideal. And we'll talk a little bit more about this in a few minutes when we get to the application. But what's important to note here is if this character in human form walked down the street and you saw them, you would run away screaming. Because first of all, they can't exist because of the proportions. But if you saw them in that proportion, it would be a nightmare for you. It would be a waking nightmare. And I have a really fun image that showcases this, which is our last slide for the lecture period. Here's somebody took the comic book version of, oh noes, what did I do? Okay. Here's somebody took the comic book version of Captain America and said, what would happen if we translated that to realism? Well, this is what would happen. And he would be a monster. It wouldn't be appealing. It wouldn't be attractive. He would be a monster because this comic artist was not making a particular statement about realism. This comic book artist was trying to push things into different places and have a particular style. And you may like it or you may dislike it, but we really have to be careful when we're dramatically offended by it. Because if we get super offended by character proportions or body types or whatever in drawings and art, then we start censoring art. Now, we're not going to have a whole long lecture about censoring art because there's a lot of things to cover there and there's no cut and dry answer. Personally, this is just me talking. I think there are things that we shouldn't do in art. I think there are things that we should, as human beings, not do, and that's okay. But we have to be careful when we start censoring stuff, because going back to that Disney image, if we say you can never create, if we say you can never create a character with these proportions, then we have eliminated an option for artists going forward. We can say, we probably should say, this is not realistic. And we have to be very careful about confusing realistic and reality, right, with fantasy, with art. But if we start saying, no, you're not allowed to do that, problems arrive, because then art becomes very, very much put in a box, and we just have to be careful about that. So that's all I'm saying. I'm not saying do this, don't do this. I'm going to say just be careful when it comes to things like being outraged by art, because it's a fine line, and it's muddy waters there. So you just have to be really careful. I lost my iPad, my Apple Pencil cap. My apologies. Okay, that kind of concludes the lecture part of what we're talking about today. And now we're going to move on from there. If I can make my mouse wake up. We're going to move on to the portion of today's live stream, which is application. And I will go out of here and we'll go into this and we'll go to here. So today we are going to talk, as it says down there in the corner, about analyzing female proportion, specifically for what I am calling Reiki style. Now, before we really dive in, we need to talk about a couple things just so that everybody's on the same page. First of all, it is very pretentious, in my opinion, to have the word Reiki style, because that's very much regulated to me personally, and it sounds very pretentious. When I started trying to figure out my new style, I called it that because I never thought I would tell any other human beings about it. It would just be this internal thing in my own mind. That's just what I would call it. So forgive me if that seems really arrogant that I'm calling it Reiki style, but in case you weren't in the last live stream, let me give you some background. When I was young, I really liked the comic Foxtrot. And while I'm doing this part, let me swap these. Okay, I really like the comic Foxtrot. And I pulled out one of the books that I have a whole shelf in the library of them. It's by Bill Ammond. It's a newspaper style comic. The characters are very stylized and very specific. You can see them. I love Foxtrot. I still love Foxtrot. I miss the dailies basically every day because he only does Sundays now. But I love Foxtrot. It's great, and I really loved it when I was young. So I started copying that style. And when I started copying that style, it kind of got into my blood, and it became almost my style revolved around what I would call Foxtrot style. I can, to this day, sit down and just draw you a Foxtrot character without even thinking for a second, without any sort of underdrawing or roughs beforehand. That's what comes out because I practiced it for like 10 years straight. Because I thought, what would be cooler than being a newspaper comic artist, right? Having your own comic in the newspaper would be amazing. Maybe I even get to work with Bill Ammond. We do Foxtrot together. We become best friends, live in a cabin on a mountain somewhere. Well, that never quite panned out, and that's okay. I did get to meet him once, and he's great. But at any rate, I no longer want to do newspaper style comics. That brings up a bit of a problem because when you practice something for a decade, or in my case, almost 3 decades, it really becomes a substantial part of your art. So I have to essentially fight what has become my natural tendency to draw in a certain way, which is kind of like 2 bubbles for eyes and dots for the pupils, and then a very flat nose and flat shapes, very graphic style, which works for a newspaper comic. But it's not what I want to do going forward. So my quest, and part of what we're doing on these live streams, is to analyze some art and then I'm going to try and develop a new style, which again, I'm calling Reiki style, that is uniquely my own and more in the direction that I want to go. It's going to entail a lot of different moving pieces. I don't even know if I can do it because I've done a lot of research and tried to figure out if somebody at age 40 could dramatically change the style that they had used for their entire life. And I have not found any real answers. So maybe it exists. Maybe that's a thing. I don't know. But I'm going to try and we're going to see what happens. So all that being said, and I'll switch screens so that I am back to mini mode on the side. All that being said, while we're doing our analysis today, remember in the beginning of the stream, I talked about the difference between objectivity and subjectivity. We are going to analyze these proportions that I have gathered together because they appeal to me in terms of art. Okay? This is what I like. I mean, that's just no other better way to put it. I have to be brutally honest with you guys about everything because there's no point in me not being honest and telling the truth here. I like this stuff. This is the type of female character design that I like. Now, that is vastly different than the type of realistic human being that I would perhaps find attractive. Again, just like that Disney example, if these characters, especially like this one, let's take this one just as an example. If this character with her proportions and her body type walked down the street, I would be terrified. I would not look at her. I would run away in the other direction because this is not realistic in terms of proportion or body type. It's just not. It's not what I'm looking for in someone. It's not what I think the ideal human should look like, because I would not take a gander to guess at what the ideal human should look like. It's not what I'm talking about here. When we're talking about the proportions, when we're talking about these female characters, Roger says that the video and sound is not in sync at this point. Okay. That's the first time that's happened, so I'm not sure how to deal with that. I will have to ask Ferdinand next time how you deal with it if it gets out of sync. I would say you turn it on and off again, but I think that would destroy the stream. So apologies if the sound is off with the video. Hopefully, since we're not doing any hardcore animation, it shouldn't matter too much, but I think probably what I'm going to have to do, Ito says it's probably okay on their end. So I think I'm going to have to at some point upgrade my computer because it's having some trouble with all this stuff, but that's okay. We'll get there. Anyway, going back to what we were talking about. When we're analyzing these female characters, I just want it to be very obvious and understood that I am not trying to make it a real human ideal. I'm not trying to say that this is the best female proportions of characters. I'm saying this appeals to me. I like this. I could look at this stuff all day long. It's just nice. It's pretty. It's beautiful. And one of the elements that I would like to put into what I'm calling Reiki style is beauty. I don't want to draw ugly things. I just don't. Some people like drawing grotesque things. Cool beans, more power to you. You do what art you need to do. For me, I want to do beautiful things. And for me, there are certain proportions that are just more appealing to me. And so that's what I'd like to draw. I hope that explains it. I hope that, to a degree, because this is so subjective and because we're talking about the female form, there's a degree where if somebody wants to be offended by this, they're going to probably just be offended. But I just wanted to let you know my thought process here, and we can go from there. Okay. So we're going to dive in. I am, for the most part, going to be looking down at my iPad. So apologies for seeing just the top of my head. I could probably just turn off I'll just leave it on just in case I look up to talk to you guys or look at the chat. But right now we're going to dive into some application. So let's go ahead and do that. We're going to start here at the top. This image is not at the top left corner because it's my favorite. It's actually one of my least favorite of the bunch. I still like it, but it just happened to be at that top position. So I just wanted to let you know that that's the case. So if we look at this character's proportions, right? We're not looking at body type. We're not looking at necessarily even shapes at this point. We're looking just at proportion. We see that we've got a head here that's about that size. The torso is going to be somewhere in this neighborhood. And then we've got the pelvis, which is, the hips are probably up here. Probably in this neighborhood. Actually, it's probably down here. So let's get rid of that. What the heck eraser do I have active? That's not the right eraser. Oh, in case anybody is curious, because I know a lot of people really like brush stuff. I like to use this brush that I'm pretty sure came with Procreate called Tinderbox, which I have subtitled Just Pleasant for my drawing because it's got kind of a looseness and a roughness to it. It allows me for some pressure sensitivity, but not too much. And then one of my favorite parts about it is if I hold the pencil slightly at an angle, it allows me to shade in different degrees and go lightly or heavy and that sort of thing. So that's why I'm using Tinderbox as a brush. Then in terms of eraser, I use something called Blocking Brush, which is literally just my own that I made. It's the most boring brush you can get because it's just flat and dull. And I actually use it when I'm doing art for blocking practice, which we will talk about in another live stream, I'm sure. But it is just flat and boring and dull. And I love it because it doesn't get in my way and it just does what I want it to do. So in case that matters, I don't use a lot of brushes in my art. That may change as my art style is changing, but whatever the case is, I just wanted to let you know. Okay, so on topic, this in its kind of compressed and different way are going to be the character proportions of this character, right? More or less. It's not exact, but art is not an exact science. Otherwise, we could definitely give it all to computers, but that's another topic. So in this case, what we're seeing, to me, is that we have a relatively largish head shape comparatively. The torso is small and the pelvis is small comparatively to everything, right? And then if we continue, my method for things like figure drawing, and let me swap again real quick. My method for things like figure drawing stems from the Youssef method, which we talked a second ago about Samantha Youssef. I have the book here. She has a wonderful art school called Studio Technique. Unfortunately, classes are not running right now. I keep saying, hey, when are you going to get back to it? But I know she's super busy. But she does have a book. It's called Movement and Form by Samantha Youssef, and it's called the Youssef Drawing Syllabus. It is heavy on the words because it's very what do I want to call it? It is very in depth. It is not just a bunch of pretty pictures like you may have seen. To draw an owl, just draw a circle and then draw the owl, that kind of thing. It is not that at all. It goes in depth. It is wonderful and glorious, and I love it. And the method that she teaches for figure drawing is one that I really appreciate. And how it works is it deals with lines of motion, line of action, however you want to put it. And then it deals with angles and it deals with solid forms before you get to all of the other stuff. So the reason that I keep talking about head and torso and pelvis is because those in the human body are key landmarks and solid forms that you build almost everything around. There are other artists who do it a different way, but this is the way that I work. So that's why I keep talking about the head and the torso and the pelvis. These are solid forms that you can put down, and then the rest can kind of connect to those things. So let's talk about the rest. From this pelvis area, we have the legs. Now this leg is bent, so we can kind of ignore that. For now, let's talk about this leg. This leg goes down and it kind of tapers down. And then we've got to kind of bump out and it tapers down again. Whoops, except that skate is in the way. Kind of tapers down again to there. And then we've got this foot. Okay. This leg is slightly coming toward us, but for the most part, this leg is pretty straight, which means that when we look at this leg compared to these other proportions like this, you will find that the leg is ridiculously long comparatively, right? Again, we're not talking about realistic human beings. Perfectly honest, I'm not what you would call a leg guy. Like, that's a thing for males. Like, some males are very attracted to women's legs. Okay, cool beans. It's not a me thing. So the fact that this girl, this artistic stylization of a female has particularly long legs does nothing for me in real life. It just doesn't. I just don't care. But in terms of art, boy, is that elegant. Boy, do I like that. I just really like the elegance of this style of proportion. So that's probably something that's going to end up in my style going forward. Not exclusively. Like, I don't want to put myself in such a box that all I can draw are long-legged female characters, because that's not very interesting. But I want to remind myself every time I'm sitting down to do a drawing that elegance is important to me in some way. And that beauty that I find in that sort of proportion is useful to know about. So, getting a drink. Okay. So that's something. Oh, okay. Sorry. Ferdinand's around. Hey, Ferdinand. I thought you were going to join the stream. I need to make, he says, make the screen big again. Okay. Will do. No, that's not the right one. There it is. See, this is why I have him around, to keep me on check. Okay. So, right. So when we're talking about these proportions, these are weird and wacky proportions when you're talking about realism. But when we're talking about stylization, this is something that we need to keep in mind or I need to keep in mind. You guys don't really need to keep in mind unless you want to draw like this. But this is something that I want to put into my head so that when I'm developing whatever this style is going to end up being, I can think about it in that way. All right, let's leave that to its own layer, and we'll move on to this collection of characters. All right, this is where things get a little trickier. Because if we look strictly at proportions of the solid forms of these characters, we're going to find a certain something. And it's not necessarily good or bad or indifferent or whatever. We're probably going to find similar elements to that first character. But we need to talk now a little more about body type and shape, because typically speaking, these characters, this grouping of characters relies more heavily on shape and body type than it does on proportion. Not exclusively, because proportion is still important here, but the curves of these female forms are elegant and pretty, and the shapes that are being used are very lovely. And that is where these find their strength, in my opinion. So let's just talk about the proportions real quick. If we got our head here and we've got our torso here and the hips are very high. So we've got our pelvis here, and that's not exactly correct, but it's close enough. These are the proportions of this particular character. If we shrink this down to be similar in size to this other character, you will see that the head size is pretty similar, right? Pretty similar. But the torso size is much longer and much larger. The rib cage on this second character is very different than the rib cage on the first character. And then the pelvis, again, we return to almost the same size. So the thing that changes dramatically between this character and the other character is, first, the torso size. The rib cage is different sized. But also, if you look at the space between, it is pretty dramatically different than the space between the first one. The first one had a lot of space between the ninth rib and the iliac crest. This one has much less space, if any space whatsoever. Given the perspective, probably that's why we're getting some overlap, because the rib cage can't you need room for the organs. But strictly speaking, you can see the difference in the distance between those two bone landmarks, right? So far, so good. Okay. if we took this same character, we're just going to focus on this one for a second because it's the most upright. It's the most easy to talk about proportion. If you look at something like this, which is not only in perspective, but also, kneeling down, kind of laying down, it's a lot harder to talk about proportion there because we have to fudge some things to reshift her out of that perspective. But this character that we're going to talk about right now is mostly in a standing and reasonable perspective. So, but there's no legs here. What this artist did was that he cut her off at the knees for the sake of this composition, I imagine. So if we added the rest of the legs, we would probably get something like this. Probably something along those lines. Now, we could change that. We could do this, or we could just as easily extend that longer. So we might come all the way down to here before we get to the foot. Right? Both of those things are options for us. We could do either one of them, and it would be an artistic choice. We could even make it longer. It would start to get a little freakish, in my opinion. But hey, we're playing around today. Let's see what happens if we go absolutely bonkers and make it ridiculous. Let's give her an unreasonably long lower leg. So, I mean, technically, this is still a thing that you could do if you wanted. And it would almost start to feel a lot more like that original character that we were talking about. Yeah. But that's a thing. All three of those things are options for us. So when it comes to this sort of art, when it comes to our style, when it comes to our choices that we make as artists, we got a lot of wiggle room because all three of these legs technically would function and they would work on this particular character, and it would just change that character a little bit because we've changed the proportions. So I don't know which I would pick. I probably would shoot for this middle one, but yeah, this one feels a little more right to me. Actually, I'd probably make it a little tiny bit longer, but not much. I'm not sure. I'd have to think about it. But it is interesting to look at it this way, right? That slightly subtle changes in proportion will change things. Rodine says, will you upload this live stream afterwards? Yes. As far as I know, all of our live streams are going to be available afterwards on the YouTube channel. You will have to click over to the live tab if you don't see it on the video tab. But we do record all of the live streams, so you can go back and rewatch them or watch them afterwards if you have to get to something more pressing, which I understand. Okay. So that's this basic character and the proportions and things. Last thing I'll talk about just very briefly, because we're not talking about shape today, but I do want to talk just briefly about shape. One of the things that's so appealing to me, at least, about this set of characters are the shape choices that are being used. This is just a very lovely shape by itself. This is just a very lovely shape by itself. These two shapes, ignoring that they are part of the female form at all, these are just lovely shapes to me to look at these shapes. And the line quality that this person used, you'll see that they have very confident lines, but they don't just do one stroke here, right? Sorry, got to get rid of that. There are searching lines, but there's a confidence there, right, in the line quality that I really like. And in one of the future lectures and live streams, we're going to talk about line quality, because line quality is a big part of the style choices that I want to make for future. But for now, I just wanted to touch on it briefly. Okay, I'm going to move on to this character. And it looks like we're coming up on an hour. And we haven't even really gotten to the drawing part yet, but that's okay. if you have to go, like I said, the live stream is available after the fact. I'm not sure how long my throat is going to hold out because I'm not used to talking for an hour straight. But we're going to give it a shot. We'll go as far as we can go, and if we have to break it up into 2 days, then we'll do it. Okay, let's talk about this character. By gosh, I love this character. Most of the art that you're going to see here that we're talking about, I have found over the course of probably the last year and a half. This piece, I remember the first time I saw it, I don't know how long ago it was, but I loved it then. And if I can just digress for 1 second, I hate to digress so much, but I'm going to do it anyway because I think that this is important. As you gain experience as an artist, as you grow as an artist, and even as a human being, your tastes are going to change. And more specifically, your ability to, I don't want to use the word judge, but I'm almost have to. Your ability to judge art, your understanding of quality will also change. So you may save some pictures on your computer in your own personal gallery when you're 15 years old that you love. And you're like, wow, look at that. If I could draw like that, I would be content for the rest of my life. And then you keep drawing and you keep doing art. And a time comes when maybe it's 10 years later, maybe 15, maybe it's 30 years later, whatever the case, you go back to that old and you look at it. Why did I ever think that was good? Like I can do better than that now, and that's not even that good, right? I mean, that can happen to you. It doesn't always happen, but it can. I found that happened a lot to me. The art that I collected as like a teenager and in my 20s, I go back and look at it and I'm like, gosh, I see all the problems with it. Like I could sit down and tell that artist how to do it better just because of experience. And I apologize if that sounds arrogant. It's just experience. As you get more experience, you just learn what works and what doesn't and why you should do certain things and why you shouldn't do others. But this piece that we're looking at now, by golly, I think that it is likely, given the quality of this piece, that I will reach my deathbed one day and still want to stare at that piece because it just appeals to me so much. So let's talk about why. First of all, let's talk about proportion. Let's talk about one thing first. And I mentioned this a little bit in the past. While we're doing these analysis, I'm going to have to talk about everything, right? I'm going to have to be honest about everything. There are certain things that are a bit taboo. There are certain things that you wouldn't talk about outside of the art world. If you sit down to a life drawing live session, you're probably going to have a nude model. And if you've never done that, or if you've yet to do that, here's how it works. You sit down and the person takes their clothes off and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm sitting here with a big sketchbook in front of me and there's a naked person right there. And this is weird because there's a bunch of other people in the room and we're all staring at this naked person. And then like 10 minutes later, you don't even think about it anymore. You really don't, because it's just form and it's just shape and you're trying to capture it and you're more angry at yourself that your lines aren't as pretty as the thing in front of you. And you're like, why isn't this working? So all that being said, I'm going to have to talk about some stuff. So we're going to talk about things like breasts. And we're going to talk about things like butts. And we're going to talk about all these sort of things because we have to. We have to, because that's what we're doing here. So forgive me if any of that is offensive, but I'm just going to have to talk about some of these things. So all that being said, I think one of the things that appeals to me about this is the breasts being separate from this silhouette with because the hair is covering it. It's creating a negative space to this positive space. And this relationship is very appealing to me as a male human being. Again, not really interested in it being realistic if this happened in real life, but boy, that's just an appealing thing to me. So I think that has a lot to do with it, but that is not exclusively why I like this. If every pose looked like this, I would be like, okay, well, that's boring. I like this because it does certain things differently in really beautiful ways. And one of the ways that I want to talk about are these two elements here, this and this, these particular forms. Now, I know we're getting a little away from proportion. We'll jump back to proportion in a second, but I want to talk for a second about this. What this artist has done is they have made a very conscious and clear decision to indicate where the ninth rib is. And as a result, this form, come on, undo. Sorry, hang on. Okay. As a result, this form, which we're going to talk about proportion-wise, is very solid. It's very clear where that is. And then there is another form that comes off of that, which is not solid. This is the fleshy part. This is the squishy bits. So that contrast between solid and defined and the next part of the figure is extremely appealing to me, because what the artist could have easily done, I would have probably done a lot too, is they could have just drawn a line like this. It would have been just a curved line that indicated that form, and it wouldn't be wrong. That line would be totally acceptable, and it would still probably be a pretty drawing. But because they have this shape that or this form that goes that way, that line that goes that way, and then another line that breaks that, it's just it adds such visual interest, and it adds not even a realism, but concreteness that you don't get if you're just doing a single line there. So I just wanted to talk about that a second, and then the same goes for this line. You can see that we have a line here, and then it dips down and goes here before it comes into the knee, right? So we have basically an S-curve sort of thing. Not quite an S-curve, but it's similar to an S-curve. But there's two forms there instead of just one. Again, this artist could have easily done this, right? They could have just made that one line, and it would have been okay. It would have been totally okay to do that. But because they chose to know their anatomy well, because they chose this conscious decision to bring out some realism, I think it makes this character and this design way more appealing than it would be if we didn't have that. So that's something that I'd like to add to my style, these conscious choices to change direction and make sure that you clarify form. But that's hard because you need to know your anatomy really well. And I need to keep working on anatomy because I neglected it for 40 years. If I can say one thing to younger artists out there, please learn your anatomy. Learn it well. I know I shouldn't say I know. For some of us like me, it's boring and it's just tedious to learn all these things. And it's like, why do I need to know that this is called the abductor and this is called the trapezius and all this stuff? And maybe you don't even need to know what they're called, but it really pays. If you want to draw wonderful figures, it really pays to know your anatomy. I need to work on that. Something for my checklist. Okay, let's get back to proportion here, because we need to we're going to power through some of the other ones, and then we'll draw a few things. Maybe, I don't know. We don't even get to that. All right, so character-wise, proportions. Here we have the head. This part is probably mostly hair, if we're going to be honest. I don't know, but for the sake of proportion, we're going to talk about it as being hair. Here, oh, it's so nice. I barely have to work. Look, they did all the work for me. Here we have the torso. And I think that is another example of how you know something is very well crafted. If you could just pick out these forms, you know that the artist knew what they were doing. You don't have to even try. It's just there. And it's really lovely. And then we have the pelvis, which is going to be somewhere in that neighborhood, and then come up here like that. The butt, specifically, I believe, gluteus maximus, this area, which is perhaps nice to look at, is almost exclusively fat. It's not as appealing when you call it. We called it in class fat pads. And we would sing na 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 fat pads. Anyway, that's irrelevant. I don't need to talk about that. But it's important to distinguish between the solid shape of the pelvis and the muscle and fat that sits on top of the bones. So we're not, when we're talking about proportion, we're not talking about this bit here specifically. That will come when we're talking about shape, when we're talking about body type, and when we're talking about other things of that nature. So just what I wanted to clarify, why I'm not including this bit in the pelvis. Okay, so here we have our next set of proportions. What do you notice? If you take a look at this, just sit for a minute, sit back, look at those three shapes, their relationships to each other. What do we notice? For me, what I notice, and I don't want to jump the gun here, I mean, by all means, think about it yourself for a second. I notice that we have, a reasonably sized head, bit small, bit on the small size by comparison. We have a substantial torso, right? The rib cage is pretty substantial. And then we're back to a small pelvis. And so how does that relate to the other things that we've talked about? Well, it's we're starting to see some similarity, some common ground, aren't we? Between these different characters and these different proportions. And that's the sort of thing that helps you when you're trying to either develop a style or when you're trying to analyze a style. You start to look at these similar things that keep appearing over and over and over again. Now, all of these drawings, well, not all, I think maybe 2 of them are the same artist, but anyway, these drawings are done by different people. So it's not like it's just one artist with their style. This is just conscious decisions, or maybe even unconscious, that the artists made, and we're learning about what is similar between them. So we've got a certain distance, right, in this area between the pelvis and the torso. We've got a certain distance in this area with the neck, although if you look, because of the hair, the neck looks a lot longer on this image. It looks visually much longer because of this extra stuff, like the strap to the top and the hair. At any rate, these are the proportions that we're looking at. And then if we continue on, again, it's going to be tricky because this leg is not exactly where it needs to be, but that's all right. We have the leg here that comes up into the knee, and then we have this part of the leg that comes here, and then we have the foot. So if we move those over to a clear spot, we can see the relationship between the pelvis and the leg. Again, look what we're getting. We're getting a pretty long leg, pretty chunky leg in a sense, comparatively to the pelvis. Maybe there's something there that I need to be aware of while I'm developing that style that I want to develop. All right. One more thing we want to talk about with this character before we move on. And we try to do that speed thing that I told you about, but I'm clearly a liar. Okay. Let's talk about this foot for a second, because it's a little related to proportion, but it's also related to shape. If you change the angle and direction of this foot, it will change not only the entire piece, but potentially the entire character. And it's a crazy, weird bit of business. Here's how it works. This foot being like this, angled down, extends this form, this shape. It draws your eye in this way, this direction, like that. As a result, her proportions feel different because there's not an obvious break there. Remember how we talked a little bit earlier about how this, still on other mode, we talked about how this form and then this middle ground feels different because of this break. Here, the artist almost avoided that to a degree because they extended the foot straight down. And if you've ever gone, for some reason, I don't know why it pops up on my Pinterest, but for some reason on my Pinterest, it often will I guess because I look at poses so much, figure drawing and stuff, but it'll pop up with like, here's how to look more elegant on camera if you're taking a photo of yourself and stuff. I think that's really interesting because sometimes they'll show you what to do and what not to do, and you can see the comparison. But at any rate, if you point your foot like this, it will extend your leg visually. And this is one of the reasons why high heel shoes are typically found to make women their legs more attractive because it elongates their leg visually. It doesn't actually do anything to their actual proportion. It does something to their to the viewer's visual proportion, right? So that's why when you see high heel shoes, that's what it does. Well, it does some other things to the muscles that make things, but it basically it makes things visually more almost elegant, more in line. And when you want to elongate, which typically that's why you wear high heel shoes, that's what happens. So that being said, let's take a look at what happens when we change that. So instead, what's the best way to do this? I'll just leave that there. Okay. If instead we have the artist, because it's not really us, but it's the artist. If the artist had made the character's foot go up like this, and for the sake of this example, we'll block this out. If we go up now, this pose feels different. It feels a little more, what's the word? It feels a little more lighthearted in a sense. It's a little less elegant. It's not bad. It's not a bad, like it's still a pretty pose. It's still a very lovely drawing. Yeah. So Luvo says tense. Yeah, that's a really good word for it. It feels more tense because the muscles are now retracted. The foot is coming up, and so there is a bit of that tenseness to it. But this is something that as artists we get to keep in mind. And it's important not to feel overwhelmed. Like don't get overwhelmed by the details, but you need to keep this in mind to a degree because all these little choices add up to either something great or something average or something good or something bad. And by bad here, I mean poor, like low quality. So it's something that you want to just keep in mind because it makes a difference. It does. It makes a difference. All these little details will add up to different things. Okay. All right. With that out of the way, I'm going to speed through the other ones, and then we still got to get to our Q&A. Oh my gosh, now I see why Ferdinand's streams are 2 hours long because it's just you could talk about this forever. Okay. This drawing, which I believe is by Loish, who I think I talked about last stream, and it's possible that other one is too, but I'm not sure. I'm betting it is, but I don't know. This drawing, let's just talk proportion for starters. Just to begin, let's talk proportion. Okay, so we've got head. We've got, whoop. Come on, undo. Okay, we've got head. We've got, oh, this is interesting. Huh. Okay, so actually, it looks like this is where the 10th rib comes. So this is a little bit cheated. Oh, somebody's cheating. That's okay. I mean, it's art, so you could do those things. But technically, this is where the torso should be, or is, because this line, which I wanted to originally draw, is actually just the bottom of the breasts. But the breasts sit on top of the rib cage. They're not. So that's interesting. Huh. Okay. Well, technically, this is the rib cage. It's pretty long. And then we have the pelvis, which in this case would go to here like that. A little less triangular shape than I usually do, but that's more in line with the Youssef method. Okay. So here we have proportions on this character, just relating the three basic shapes. Again, take a second, look at it. What do we see? What's similar about the other ones that we looked at? What's different than the other ones we looked at? Obviously, this has a curve to it. We've got a little bit of perspective going on, so it's not going to be exact. But again, what we can see here is we've got, a decently smallish head, medium small head. We've got a substantial torso comparatively to the head, and then we've got a slightly smaller pelvis. Now, in this case, because I've drawn the box instead of like the actual, I had been drawing more of a triangular shape, which To do it in like 3D, you would need the side plane as well, which actually I don't even know if that's, yeah, I think that's where it would be. Oh, actually it would be, you'd be able to see in the pelvic bucket, as we'd call it. Anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. The pelvis is on this character, or on these proportions, it's a lot larger, I think, than the other ones that we saw. And that's cool. It's still really nice drawing, really nice design, character proportions and things. And then again, let's take a look at pelvis to legs. We've got this, and then we've got, okay, again, this whole area in here, right, is fat and muscle. It's not actually necessarily the proportions we're talking about, but that's okay. We'll draw it in here anyway. And it comes down, and then the knee is probably going to be somewhere in this area, I would imagine. And then the second, there's a lot of clothes here, so it's harder to tell. And look at the foot again, just what we talked about before. The foot is nice and angled downward. So we've got that elegance again coming up. But here we have, again, the proportions between the pelvis and the leg. Boy, here again, I mean, I think we're just seeing a really clear pattern, if you ask me. It's getting pretty obvious what it is that draws these poses and these character designs together. Okay, this character is very interesting because not only do we have forced perspective, which is going to throw everything off, so it's going to be very hard to analyze this in the same way as the others, because it's dramatic perspective compared to the others. But also, the proportions are much more pushed, and the bodies, the body type is also pretty heavily pushed compared to the others. Like that, now we're in terms of body type. I don't like this character. I'm not a fan of a waist that looks like it's ready to snap in half. Like, as a character designer, I don't like that look. It's just not for me. It doesn't do anything for me. I don't like it. I would prefer that this character have more of an actual waist. That to me is much more appealing than this ridiculous, we're going to go down to a point where there's no room for organs. That's just me. But what we see here is head size. We'll go back to those. We've got the torso in here. And then the pelvis is going to be really tricky because there's this skirt. And I feel like this is maybe here. It gets tricky here. Like, I'm not exactly sure. And we're in perspective, so it's kind of a mess. But what you can see here is this character's proportions are pretty different than these other ones that we've seen, right? Because in this one, look at all the space in between the torso and the pelvis. That's pretty significant compared to a lot of the other ones. And the neck is reasonably long and thin, but it still feels a little different. And then in terms of the general proportions, the head is much larger, especially than the torso here. And the torso is tiny. And then the pelvis it's also tiny. This is not a fair drawing of the pelvis. I can't get the actual, there's too much going on there with perspective with the forms. But anyway, you see that this character has very different proportions. However, that being said, one of the similarities that we still have is we've still got the legs and we've still got the foot that points in a particular direction, right? So there's another example of it happening yet again. I'm kind of doing this analysis live. Like, I'm not there. Stop doing that. This character I looked at in advance, which is why I was able to talk about the ninth rib there and the different planes. The other ones I didn't. So I'm really discovering this with you guys. All I did was pull these images based on pure instinct, what I liked, what I didn't like, that sort of thing. So this is pretty enlightening to me that I'm figuring these things out as we're going. but I didn't plan on that. That's just apparently what happens. Okay, let's go down here for a second. I don't have a lot to talk about here because we don't have most of the body. I really like this art. It may be partially because it's a character that I know. We're going to have a lecture at some point to talk about the difference between quality of art and content. Because sometimes you're drawn to something because of what it represents or the content. In this case, it's Princess Peach. And she's got some piranha plant flowers for her wedding. And then sometimes you're going to be drawn to something because it's very appealing in terms of art or the quality is high. You might hate the subject even, but the quality will be so high that you're like, wow, look at that art. It's great art. And also I hate it. In this case, I might be drawn to this a little more because of the content, but that's okay. We're still going to talk about the perspective. Perspective. We're going to talk about the proportion. So we got basically head here, and we've got, this goes down to here really. But again, we don't have, unfortunately, the rest of the character. So this one's going to be slightly limited. But here we have head size versus torso size, at least. And this is interesting. The things that I think I find most appealing about this are firstly, the separation, this negative space here, I really like. And we'll have to talk about positive and negative space another time, but I like that. There's something about that appeals to me. So the thing that I think draws me to this image is firstly that, and then again, we've got to go back to the breasts. This sort of shape and I dig it. It just appeals to me. So just being honest, that's one of the things about that particular design that does make me drawn to it. But those are the proportions of that character. If we go down to this character, and we're really cruising now because we're at an hour and a half. We haven't even gotten to Q&A yet. If we go to this character, all right, we've got head shape or size. It's going to be tricky because she's wearing bulky clothes, but that's okay. We can kind of a little bit estimate where things are. Okay, so proportion-wise, this is essentially what we've got. And so we're running into that situation of medium to small head, decent sized torso, and then smaller pelvis. And then again, if we look at the leg, this is another interesting thing. Even though that's technically in perspective, they did push the foot downward just to make it slightly more elegant. But anyway. And so we pull the leg off of here. We can see this similar thing to the other ones that we've got. It's not quite as extreme with this character, but we still have that. And visually speaking, this character seems like she has longer legs because of where the bottom of her dress hits her. So because of where this hits, it feels longer than if the dress was like down here. She would feel shorter if this was all of the dress. She would feel shorter. But because the dress is slightly higher, that's why we get this elongation in the leg in that regard. So just put those over. And one more to go. And then we're going to finish up the application and analysis section, and we'll dive into some short Q&A before we wrap up for the day. And that's good because my throat's giving out. All right, let's talk about this character. From a purely subjective perspective, this piece and this piece are my favorites. I just like them most. Now, full disclosure, one of the reasons that this piece that we're going to talk about now is what I would call a favorite is because of the coloring, of the lighting, of things like that. My iPad is getting unhappy with me because I've been working and my hands are sweaty and then now my gestures aren't working. Anyway, okay. So one of the things I really like about this piece is the lighting and the coloring. I like the pose. I like the proportion still, which we'll talk about in a second, but it's tricky because if you find a piece you really like and it's more finished like this, it's going to be harder to figure out what you like about it. It's still possible. You should still analyze it, but it will be harder because there's so many likable things about this piece. Do I like her hat and how amazing it is to be so large compared to the rest of her? Do I like these feathers that are coming out from the back? Do I like the pose? Do I like the is that a broom, I guess, that's hanging from her shoulder, the way that hangs? Do I like the detail on the dress? Do I like the colors? Do I like the lighting? All these things come into play when it's a more finished piece, and it can get tricky. So we're going to ignore all that for a second. Hide that. We're going to ignore all that for a second. We're just going to talk proportion. So, because I think that if you take it away, nothing else, here's what I would say to take away. When you want to analyze a piece, break it down to one thing. Don't try and analyze it all at once. It's going to be too hard. If I sit here and talk about everything I love about this, I'll end up talking about what I love about it, like I just did. But I'm not going to be able to figure out how to incorporate that into my own work. So we're just going to look at proportion now. We're going to ignore the fact that it's well lit and beautifully colored. We're just going to talk proportion. And so if we just talk proportion, what we will find here is this character, and apologies because, again, we're going with different perspective. Now the front of the rib cage is over here, which means that it's going to be different in a sense because the 10th rib is going to be in this area now instead of over here, but that's fine. We'll make it work. But that's the torso. And then this is beautiful. See this spot right here? Let's zoom in all the way. We can see the difference, between this fleshy bit and where the iliac crest is, the hip bone. We can see it, we can feel it. And it's so zoomed in, you wouldn't even really think about it. But while you're looking at the picture as a whole, you notice it. Your subconscious will notice it. So anyway, okay, so we got that, and we have our hips, which would be in here, and got the hand there. So I think we're coming down this way. We might have cheated a little bit, person who did this drawing. I think we're going to have to come in here-ish. Apologies if this is incorrect. This is when it gets tricky for me because I still need to practice finding those solid forms behind stuff. But basically, this is what we're going to end up with in terms of proportion. In a sense, this is a little bit more normal proportion, what I would call normal, than all the other stuff we've looked at so far in terms of this analysis. But guess what's going to happen? What's going to happen is when we add those legs. If I've learned nothing else from the stream today and this analysis, it's apparently I dig the pretty long legs on a female character. So weird to me because it's not at all. That's just not my jam in real life. But all right, hey, whatever works. Something about it. All right. There's some weird stuff going on here. The more I analyze this, the more I'm seeing that I'm not sure that that's accurate, but that's okay because you can get away with stuff in art, and it works. Maybe it's I don't know. This line right here confuses me because I don't think it should be there, but maybe it should. I don't know. I'd have to think more about it than doing it live. Anyway, so let's talk about the legs yet again. We've got, oh boy, she has some fat pads going on. This leg comes up here to there. Then we come down here. That is a lot of muscle and fat and all the other hooshy bits. And then look, we got a nice elegant foot again. But let's move that aside. Here we go. So I must be missing something with this pelvis. If Sam ever comes and watches this, she's going to be like, oh, you got that all wrong, but that's fine. So again, I mean, I think it's very. I wish it was as obvious for the rest of the proportions as it now has become for the bottom part, because it seems very obvious. Look at that, the pelvis is not very large. The gluteus maximus is significant, and the hamstrings and the padding on the hamstrings, and then the length. It's significant, and we can tell that that's what it is. All right. We are going to group all of these analyses together, and we are going to hide them. And then we're going to pull up one more layer, and we're going to do a bit of a drawing. Dylan in the chat says hi. Hi, Dylan. Let's put together what we have just kind of learned for the analysis purposes. If I am going to draw a female character in the proportional style that apparently appeals to me, here's what it's going to contain. It is going to contain a head shape that is not what I would consider small or significantly large. All of these head shapes they seem decently properly proportioned to the rest of the body, but in relation to the other aspects, I would say that it's on the smaller side. When it comes to distance between head, solid form, and torso, ribcage, solid form, we're not going to the extreme. So I'm not, for example, probably going to draw a character that has a neck like that, like ostrich style, which is interesting because that's more my proportions. I'm not a fan. I don't mind a longer neck, but we want to keep it reasonable here. So I would probably put less space in this area. But we're going to get rid of the neck for now because we're just talking about proportion. Okay. In terms of torso, we have two options because we kind of saw two things in our analysis today. We saw kind of a longer and substantial torso. And then if we could just copy and paste this a second, we also saw a significantly smaller torso. So more like this. Both of those things we have seen today in our analysis. Dylan asks what the character's name. I assume you mean what's the character's name. None of these are my characters, Dylan. I'm analyzing other art so that we can construct some new and original things afterwards and develop a style based on them and all these things that we're going to learn. So no characters yet, but eventually we'll create some characters and then we'll call it the character something. Okay, so both of these things, both of these proportions we have seen today in our analysis. We've seen the head that's medium-sized to small, and then a small torso, and we've also seen a medium-sized head and then a longer torso. In almost every instance that we have seen so far, the pelvis is not only close to the torso, but it typically is going to be on the smaller side. Not always. And here, Sam would also probably be mad at me because I'm using a triangle instead of a square, because in the Youssef method, we're going to use an egg shape for the torso and a rectangle or square for the pelvis. But forgive me, Sam, I'm going off script. So in any case, we're looking at a smaller pelvis comparatively to the torso, comparatively to the head. And these are going to be, for the most part, the proportions that I would say are probably I'm going to move forward with while I'm developing this style that's uniquely my own, that I want to do, that I love doing, or hopefully will love doing. This is probably a starting point for me of those things. Now, that's just the solid forms. The other thing that we very obviously learned today is that from this place, we are going to have significant fat pads. We're going to have significant gluteus maximus, significant hamstrings. It's going to be longer. We're going to come into the knee, and then we're going to have we're going to have longer legs on the character. And then the other thing that we learned was if point the feet gets more elegant. So that's something we need to think about. Oops, I 2 layers. Okay. So that's kind of what we learned today. This is what kind of draws everything else together in terms of proportion to a degree. There's always going to be little modifications, little differences, but this is kind of the main thing that I think that we've come across today, which is wonderful to know. So what my plan is now is I'm going to take what I learned here. I'm going to let it ruminate in my head for a bit. And then I'm going to try and apply it to some actual drawing. I'm going to draw some characters. They're probably going to be terrible because I'm still figuring this out. It's almost honestly like starting over, but in a sense, it's like starting over but worse because I have tendencies in me already that I've built up over 30 years that I have to fight. And so those tendencies are going to want me to do certain things, and I'm going to have to be like, no, you can't do that anymore. It's a very interesting thing trying to change your art style. I don't know if I'd recommend it yet. It's fascinating. I'm loving the experience, which is more than I can say about the first time around and learning art. I did not enjoy it. I rarely enjoy doing art, but this is joyful. I love doing this. I could sit here with you guys for another 2 hours and do this. We're not going to. I'd die, but I could. Okay. All right. So with that out of the way, we are going to go to some brief Q&A before my throat totally gives out. So we'll pop that up. If you have a question about anything we talked about today or about something else related to art, animation, we're not going to go heavy into any particular answer because again, throat, but I'm going to try and answer anything that I can. And if you have a particular question, you can always ask during any of the live streams because Ferdinand's going to do a new live stream soon. I can't tell you exactly when because his schedule is kind of crazy, but he's going to do one soon. So look forward to that. And we'll be able to continue to answer questions and things like that. I think we're on a little bit of a delay, so I'm going to give it some time in case anybody has any questions to ask. While we're at it, I will shut down the old iPad. No, wait. I just need to stop sharing it. There's a button just for that. Okay. So I hope this has been informative for you. It certainly was for me. I'm really enjoying going through these things. As a little precursor, next time, let me open this thing back up real quick. Next time, we're going to be talking about one of the other categories. I don't know what that will be. We're going to have to figure that out. But the other categories that we have so far to look at are line quality, chunkiness and form, backgrounds, femininity, which I think we covered a little bit of today, compelling story or curiosity, because one of the things that I found that is, it keeps coming up in all these images that I really like, is there's some element that makes you look twice and be like, huh, look at that. Or I want to know more about that world, or something about it that's just extra compelling rather than just a character on a page, which is fine too. Sometimes you just want to do that. Continuing, we have lighting. We have color 1 through 3, which will end up being color 1 through a bajillion. And then I started a file yesterday called The Goal, which is going to, it's going to collect all these ideas together. So after the stream today, I'm going to go into this file called The Goal, and I'm going to write down all the things that I learned today in today's stream. And then I'm going to try and apply them. Okay, we've got a question popping up. So Luvo says, any advice for drawing boobs and how to integrate them well into the torso? All right, let's see. Let me precursor this by saying I'm not an expert at drawing breasts. I like them, but I have not practiced drawing them much. There has always been this sort of tendency in me to be a little embarrassed by doing it. And I hate to even use the word embarrassed because I don't really care what other people think of me. Like I don't. I've moved past that in my life, but there's just this element from like childhood where it's like, oh, you don't talk about that. So I don't have a specific I don't have a specific any tips specifically to give you, but I will say a couple things. First of all, boy, this is like a whole live stream in itself. Forgive me, I'm going to go very quickly, but if you want, I will do if Ferdinand lets me, I'll do a live stream in the future just on this subject. Placement on the torso matters dramatically. Okay? If you put breasts too high, it won't look right. If you put them too low, it will feel like an older person or that they don't have any support whatsoever. So you have to worry about proportion just in the terms of the torso, right? So if you have a torso, you need to make sure that they are placed in the right place. That's going to be the most significant thing. In terms of integration into the torso, that's going to make the biggest difference for you, where you are placing. The other thing about breasts is shape is paramount. And to a degree, there's a bit of a personal preference quality. But if you study the difference in shapes, you're going to have a significant, or even not a study, if you change shape there, you're going to have a significant difference in output, because some people will have very long shapes that are almost hanging. I've seen tutorials that do like water balloons, and that's a little more realistic, yes, but we're not always being realistic. Some are like these, I don't even know how to explain it. It's just like this weird oval shape that shoots out from the chest that is, in my opinion, really bizarre, but some people dig it. I think in general, the best thing you can do is almost have them be secondary elements. A lot of people want to make the breasts the main feature of a piece. And if you go online, well, you'll find a lot of that. I don't think that's going to ever do as much for making the whole figure beautiful as focusing on making it correct to the character. I don't know if that helps. Again, we're going to have to talk about this at length, but I hope that helps a little bit, Luvo, answer your question a little bit. Dylan asks, what's your name? Reminds me of the old San Francisco Rush. Well, what's your name? My name is JK. JK Riki. I am one of the founders of Animator Island. You may not be familiar with me because I just kind of went away for a while, and Ferdinand, like a hero, took over and has been running things. But I'm trying to help out around here a little bit more, so I should see you more often. But Ferdinand and I both started this crazy ride together, 10 years ago now, 11. I don't know how long it's been. It's been a million years. But my name's JK. Welcome to the stream and hello. Okay. We've got Rodine. Forgive me, Rodine, if it's not pronounced that way. Rodine says, do you have books you can recommend that covers both animation and drawing? Oh boy, do I. All right. It's tricky to have a book that covers both because both topics require multiple volumes just to do it well. I held up before Movement and Form by Samantha Youssef. She is an animator. That's what she does. She's a former Disney animator. So all of her drawing stuff is going to relate to animation and movement. She also does ballet. And that helps her get this elegance in her drawing that I wish I had. But I don't think I'll do ballet. We'll see. Anyway, that's a great book. Another one that I have just sitting here with me is Drawn to Life. Drawn to Life is a collection of notes from Walt Stanchfield. Stanchfield, yeah. that was put together after his death, but he was the guy who taught drawing at Disney. Literally, he was the guy for a long time. And a lot of it is on gesture drawing, but it's also on shape and movement and things like that. You're not going to find a ton of animation principles, but almost everything is related to animation because he was teaching animators, if that makes sense. I have some other books on my shelf in the other room that I could probably bring out next time and talk about. But if you want to start in somewhere, those two are pretty great. I definitely recommend them. And hopefully Sam will eventually do an animation book. She has a lot of work ahead of her. She's got stuff to do. But that would be a really good book to read if it ever comes about. Okay. Quick question from EK Illustration. JK, EK, got a natural affinity there. Sorry, I just tuned in at the end, but it sounds really interesting. Is this a regular stream? I'm hoping it will become a regular stream soon. I can't promise on an exact specific time. I know Ferdinand typically, forgive me if I'm wrong, I think he typically shoots for Thursday or for Friday, Saturday, Thursday, Friday, or Saturday, right? Somewhere in that neighborhood. My schedule is way more erratic. So I'm going to try and do this. But if you want to be sure, you can sign up for notifications and stuff and it'll pop up. I try to post on Twitter via the Animator Island account at least an hour before I'm going to do one. And if I can get my act together, I'll try and announce it like a day in advance so that there's a little more time to plan for it. If you guys, if there's a specific time in either Eastern Standard Time where I am or Greenwich Mean Time, which is kind of world standard. If there's a specific time that you guys like and works for you, please let me know. You could just post a comment in the section under the video itself, or you can send something on Twitter or an email or whatever. But anyway, long answer, right? For something very simple. It is not a regular stream yet, but I bet it will become one as I continue to do these analysis pieces. Cool. Oh, and then this isn't really a question, but Tangibles says or asks, make a video about hand posing. Hands are super important, so I definitely think we'll cover that in the future. Right now, it's a little more micro than what I'm trying to figure out for my own personal style. And for the next couple streams, at least, we're really going to keep diving into a bit of a lecture and then analysis and application and then the Q&A revolving. And I apologize because I feel very selfish about it, but I hope you'll get something out of it too. I'm doing this so that I can figure out my style. And once I do a little bit more, once I have a better grasp of what I want to create, then I think I can move on to doing things like making a video about hand poses and construction and stuff like that, because I'll know all the principles that I want to apply to that will make it fun to do. So anyway, I hope that answers that question and in good shape. Cool. That was a lot of the questions that popped up, and I'm seeing people say thank you and mostly just thanks across the board. Thank you guys for coming and listening, and I hope you learned something. Look at that. We just topped out right around the 2-hour mark, which I guess is an Animator Island staple. Let me know any thoughts that you have, anything you think could be improved, anything you want me to think about for future streams. We're going to keep doing this. I will be back with you next week if all things go well and God is willing. But that's the plan. I'm going to try and get back to you and do another one next week. I can't tell you exactly what day, but it will probably be around the 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time because that fits really nicely into my work schedule. So cool beans. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next time. Bye.